Okay, now that we've learned a little bit about what cooperative learning is, why people use it, let's talk about implementation. How do we get students engaged in their own learning in the classroom? We basically have three types of cooperative learning groups that instructors typically use in classes: informal groups, formal groups, and base groups. And for each of these, I'm going to provide a bit of a background of the values, the utilities of each one, what kind of teaching and learning objectives you might use, and then give you an example of each that you may use, adapt for your own classrooms. So let's first start with informal groups. Informal groups do need advanced planning. Even though these are relatively quick, short exercises, oftentimes intermixed within a class, they do need advanced planning. Second of all, they're very good for large classes. They're a way to engage students quickly in their own learning, assess what kind of learning is going on or what questions students have, and let the professor or instructor proceed or address those kind of questions and then move on. The largest class that I've taught is, I think, about 125 students, and some of these informal cooperative groups is a great way to get students engaged. You do have to be explicit, though, when using informal groups in terms of what is the goal for the informal group activity. Share with the students your expectations for their learning as you're providing instructions. In your instructions, be explicit about what do you want students to do, what are they actually responsible for, and make sure that you tell them how much time they have to complete their task. One example that I've used, and perhaps you used it, or maybe some of your friends or colleagues have used it, is a turn to your neighbor type of activity using minute papers. And minute papers could be used at the beginning or end of the class. I've actually used them in the middle of class as well to kind of break up a 50-minute class period. And one of the ways in which I've used it, the technique can be modified, is you might have students respond to a multiple choice question, first individually, jot down their thoughts to justify their selection, and then turn to their neighbor to discuss their answer with their neighbor's answer, and then collectively come up with what they think is the one best multiple choice answer and a group justification. After doing that, you as the instructor might quickly do a survey of the class in terms of who picked what answer to the question, and to collectively see what kind of justifications they gave. So another example and a benefit of this activity that I've often used in my own field, so this is an example, a wildlife ecology example, is after we've had a unit on managing forest ecosystems to meet objectives to conserve biological diversity. This is a class for natural resources related majors. I asked students to respond to a scenario. I asked them to turn to your neighbors, and with their partners, I want them to describe how clear-cutting aspen across the landscape can help conserve biological diversity. I tell them they have 2 minutes to develop a response. So by this point in the class, we've talked about clear-cutting, we've talked about biological diversity, they know something about aspen as a species, about its ecology. And there's two very important parts of this instructions I've given students. First of all, I expect them to describe how clear-cutting aspen across the landscape can conserve biological diversity. I don't want them to define anything. I don't want them to define clear-cutting. I don't want them to define biological diversity. I'm assuming by asking this question that they know those lower level types of information. What I want to know is to describe things. So if you look at this in a Bloom's taxonomy perspective, this is a little bit higher level learning expectation that I have for my students. And second of all, I tell them they only have 2 minutes. So I expect them to work quickly to develop a response. So a little bit more about informal cooperative groups, some guidance that I might offer that certainly that others would offer as well is, first of all, it can be used at any time. Use it at the beginning of the class, maybe for check for understanding of the material from the previous class. It can be short term. Keep it short, keep it simple. Don't make your questions too complex. Our students are certainly going to need more time. And third, it's very, very helpful to use these kind of activities to break up a class period. Second of all is informal groups do provide an opportunity for students to process material they've listened to. This is critical, especially if you're teaching large classes. Dr. Carl Smith describes the procedures as kind of a bookends as a way to break up a class period. I'll demonstrate this in a minute. But informal groups aren't necessarily as effective to meeting some of the, especially the higher level learning that you may want students to have, as if you were to use formal cooperative groups, which we'll talk about later, or cooperative based groups. So I talk about the bookends model that Dr. Smith talks about in some of his publications, or what I refer to as active lecturing or effective lecturing. This is a 50-minute class period. So you might have some organization. This would require developing good interpretive questions that you're going to ask your students to respond to in these informal groups. You might do some quick lecturing. You might pose an interpretive question for students to turn to their neighbor to discuss. You might have more lecturing, reporting out of what their responses are. You might give students another problem, maybe have them develop a minute paper that could be turned in either for a grade or for more kind of a participation point, so to speak, but also a way for you to see were students really understanding the concepts or principles that you were discussing that day. And then last of all, kind of finishing up the class period. So these kind of 10, 12-minute segments of mini lectures, so to speak, is structured this way because of some of the research that's been done on understanding how long we can expect students to retain information after extensive periods of presenting or lecturing. These are just a few examples of some class summary types of questions you might want to try using in your classrooms if you haven't already. Is first of all, reflect on what was the most important points of today's presentation for you. Again, or maybe what questions do you have, or what was the muddiest point from today's class. These kind of questions that are more summary kind of questions, they're not comprehension questions. If I were to use these in my class, I typically would not have students put their names on the papers because you want these to be anonymous so that if students were really unclear of something, you don't want them to think that they're not interested, or that there are going to be repercussions if they, depending upon the kind of questions that they're asking. Another kind of class summary question that you might ask is to have students discuss with their partner questions like what parts of the points that we covered in class today were useful, which ones were meaningful, which ones were interesting, and questions that they have. And again, turn papers in. These could be electronic submissions or hard copy submissions, and you can look at them to think about how effective was your class period today. So what I do is the next class period, I start the class with responding to the primary questions that students have. I tell them, so based on the questions I asked you yesterday, is that these were some of the primary questions or the muddiest points people had, and so let's clarify those before you move on. You're asking them for their input, you're asking them for what they need more information about, what questions they have. You have to respond to it, and you have to respond to it in a timely manner.